the line with Dubé. Throw the head for Dubé. He shoots, scores! Dylan Dubé!
5 professional hockey players now facing charges related to a sexual assault investigation dating back to 2018. Alleging 8 players on Canada's 2018 World Junior Ice Hockey team sexually assaulted her and abused her.
In 2018, Canada's national junior team took home their 17th gold medal at the annual World Juniors competition. A few months later, in the summer, members of that team and other young hockey players gathered for a golf event put on by Hockey Canada. At that event, 8 players are alleged to have taken a young woman back to a hotel room and subjected her to a variety of non-consensual sexual acts for hours. The woman filed a lawsuit. Hockey Canada settled and hoped it would go away, something they had been doing with great success for decades. But this case didn't go away. The investigation was initially closed but reopened in 2022, and criminal charges were laid against several players. The response from Hockey Canada, the NHL, and any other hockey organization that cared to comment was that this was unacceptable, not part of the game, and that a few players had made some terrible choices. But that is far from the truth. The facts are that sexual assault and violence are part of Canadian hockey, and have been for as long as anyone can remember. In this video, we look at the complicated factors that have created a toxic culture in hockey of hazing, hypermasculinity, sexual assault, and violence that leads to both the detriment of its players and their victims, and what needs to happen to create a brighter future for the sport and its players. It's difficult to understate the value of hockey to Canada's cultural identity. The sport has been used as a tool to say what it means to be Canadian for decades. Throughout its history, hockey has not only been a way of defining cultural identity, but has created a blueprint for what it means to be a hockey player. That blueprint has barely changed in the last 50 years. If we look at the average journey of a young child that will make the NHL, we can see where all the elements of that blueprint start to come into play. Connor McDavid, probably the best player in the world today, started playing hockey at age 3. Even at that age, his parents would have become acquainted with the first factor: cost. A 2019 study found that the average Canadian family spends about $1,700 on hockey costs every year. In 2024, that number was $4,478. Even for young kids, the cost of registration, league fees, and equipment usually will cost a family at least $1,000. If you're playing recreational hockey, the cost of equipment is significant, but is by far the largest price tag. You may be looking at $1,000 every few years to update a child's equipment as they grow, plus team fees, which may be a few $100s. If your child wants to be elite, it's a whole different story. The cost of just joining a competitive team, one that travels to tournaments and has frequent set practice times, is often between $4,000 to $10,000. But all of that, the top-of-the-line equipment, frequent practices, travel teams, tournaments, are simply not enough. The margin separating the kids who go pro and those who don't is thinner than it's ever been. Across Canada, enrollment in youth hockey has been steadily declining since 2010. In 2021, the US reported 400,000 kids enrolled in hockey, passing Canada for the first time. Hockey interest has grown significantly across Europe. The result is that hockey families are spending more and more money on workshops, classes, camps, and special training programs that cost tens of thousands of dollars. If we use Connor McDavid as an example again, he attended a $40,000 hockey summer camp that had been attended by a number of NHL superstars. All of this contributes to something much darker than just inflated costs. It's part of the broader picture of a sport that's often been deemed as for some but not for all. Carefully curating who is allowed into hockey is part of what perpetuates its broken culture, and elitism has increasingly become part of that. For the players, the amount of time and money their parents have sunk into their hockey careers contributes to a tremendous amount of pressure that sits on the shoulders of young athletes. A 2023 study found that players reported both implicit and explicit pressure to perform, or risk being cut, ostracized, or traded. One player shared that their coach kept a shopping cart in the hallway. If they didn't perform, their equipment would end up in a garbage bag in the shopping cart. Players explained that they felt commodified. They were expected to play through pain and potential long-term damage to their bodies. Since competition is so high, taking a week off to recover from an injury may mean losing your roster spot or being traded to a worse team. The pressure to play year-round and ignore injuries is causing overuse injuries in younger and younger players. Injuries that impact not only their potential career, but their health for the rest of their lives. They were socialized to adopt a culture of hypermasculinity, ignoring pain, not asking for help, and hiding emotional or physical distress. Violence itself is a core part of hockey's culture on the ice. Although more awareness around concussions has caused the NHL to crack down on certain types of violence in the sport, fights and hits are still a huge part of the game. They are frequently rebroadcast on highlight shows or shared on social media as exciting moments of the sport, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates the fans' desire for violence and the players' need to carry it out. These are not unique features of hockey. American football, most notably, and other sports play into the same pattern, although fighting, in any other context assault, is unique to hockey, an act that would be criminalized in normal life, but is rewarded on the ice. Off the ice, that culture has been reinforced in violent and horrific ways, in how the players treat other players. Laura Robinson wrote a book all the way back in 1998 called Crossing the Line: Violence and Sexual Assault in Canada's National Sport. In it, she highlights the idea that in junior hockey, young men see themselves as objects and thus objectify others. She also calls out a culture of hazing, bullying, and degradation in minor hockey, perpetuated by staff, coaches, and senior players. In 2020, a class action lawsuit was filed against the CHL by former players, alleging they were hazed in a variety of awful ways, penetrated anally by foreign objects, forced to eat or drink bodily fluids such as semen and urine, encouraged to drink heavily, physically beaten, forcibly shaved by teammates, and made to have sex with women while their teammates watched. Hazing has been linked to PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse issues, dissociative disorders, and other mental health problems. In locker rooms, talk about who you're hooking up with is commonplace, as is sharing private photos sent by women with your teammates. In 2021, just before the draft, it became public that Logan Mailloux had photographed and disseminated images of a woman performing a sexual act without her consent. He was criminally charged in Sweden, but the Montreal Canadiens still took him in the first round. He paid a fine. Despite institutional efforts to clamp down on this behavior, an independent review panel commissioned by the CHL has found that it has persisted. It's little surprise that players who underwent this sort of treatment perpetuated it. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, there were a number of cases in which a single woman, typically underage, was sexually assaulted by a group of minor hockey players. Afterwards, coaches, players, and sometimes leagues would engage in a process of defaming these women in order to cast doubt on their claims. In one case, a young woman who was assaulted was charged with mischief and later attempted suicide. Graham James, the coach of the Swift Current Broncos, whose players had committed the assault, spoke about how hard the incident was on his team. James is now known for sexually assaulting many of his players. In another, the WHL president said that the assaulted woman had a reputation. In all cases, the charges were dropped. It's here that hockey's impact on Canada's cultural identity has been used as a powerful tool to silence those who would speak out against this type of behavior. Sheldon Kennedy, one of Graham James's victims, said that when he first spoke about his experiences, many told him to stay quiet so he wouldn't ruin the game. It's a tremendous amount of pressure for a young person to navigate, especially while enduring abuse no one should have to experience. The end result is that most players stay silent about the abuse they've endured or the abuse they've witnessed their coaches or teammates enact. Often, they perpetuate similar abuse towards others, or turn to partying or substance abuse to try to cope. And rarely are there significant consequences. Graham James ended up with only 3.5 years in jail, after pleading guilty to over 350 encounters with underage players over 10 years. Later, he was sentenced separately to 5 years in prison after former NHL star Theo Fleury's autobiography detailed how James had abused him since he was 14. It's suspected that James abused nearly 100 kids, but only 4 have ever come forward. But cases in which players are the perpetrators have largely been dismissed. Believe it or not, the main reason the 2018 assault case has continued to gain attention may come down to money. An investigation at the time by the Standing Committee on National Heritage found that Hockey Canada had created a reserve fund called the National Equity Fund, that drew on minor hockey membership fees to settle sexual misconduct cases. Up to that point, Hockey Canada had paid out settlements in 21 sexual assault cases since 1998 from that fund, totaling millions of dollars. Parents and organizations were outraged that their membership fees were being used to settle sexual assault cases. In the immediate aftermath, most of Hockey Canada's sponsors suspended their relationships, and Hockey Canada pledged to do more to end systemic issues in hockey. The case didn't end with a settlement. London, Ontario police began investigating, and in 2024, Alex Fermenton, Carter Hart, Dylan Dubé, Michael McLeod, and Cal Foote were formally charged with sexual assault. This case is worrisome for yet more reasons. Because since the early 2010s, almost every minor hockey league had implemented procedures to try and prevent this sort of thing from happening. Most, if not all, of the players who took part in the 2018 incident would have gone through these programs. So why are they working? For one, it's only in recent years that these programs have actually started to focus on the athletes themselves. For much of the 90s and 2000s, various leagues had responded to sexual misconduct by banning it. That was rarely enforced and also was not an effective deterrent. Many of the sexual education programs are simply not effective. The OHL's flagship Onside program is a single 2-hour workshop for new players. If you've ever been forced to sit through a 2-hour workshop on anything, you can probably attest to how little it impacted you in the long term. Violence prevention programs are at their most effective when they feature shorter, personal interactions that are ongoing over long periods of time. Another issue is that it comes too late. Many players begin getting this education when they enter the OHL, at around 16 or 17. By the time they're 12 or 13, if they're talented, they've already likely been exposed to and socialized by hockey's hypermasculine culture. By the time they're 16, they may have already undergone their first hazing. By that point, you aren't educating, because that player first has to unlearn years of behavior around what they believe is intrinsic to being a hockey player and being a man. Things are beginning to change. The publicity of the 2018 assaults, as well as the courage of athletes like Theo Fleury, Dan Carcillo, and Sheldon Kennedy, among others, has helped to normalize conversations around abuse done to and committed by players. Many nonprofit organizations, as well as funds supported by Hockey Canada, the NHL, and others, are engaging in scholarships, equipment exchange programs, and other initiatives to make hockey more affordable and remove some of the barriers of entry for less affluent players. The same is true of organizations that support BIPOC players, subsidizing registration or equipment fees, helping to provide opportunities to increase diversity in the sport. After the pandemic, hockey enrollment numbers rebounded substantially, in large part due to a big rise in enrollment among women and girls. In 2024, it hit record numbers of over 100,000, fueled in part by the popularity of the PWHL. Female coaches and officials are also increasing in huge numbers, although female coach retention is 12.8% lower than men due to heavy criticism and negative interactions. These initiatives allow a wider array of voices and perspectives to join the game, perspectives that may have a higher chance of resisting and changing the toxic parts of hockey's culture rather than being assimilated by it. All of these trends are promising, but not yet enough. If hockey can become democratized to men, women, BIPOC players, members of the LGBTQ+ community, players of all income brackets and all ability levels, then not only will we see a more vibrant and exciting game on the professional level, but create a culture that will prevent violence and create a more equitable, enriching, and humane experience for players. To do so, Canadians will need to face head-on the reality of their national sport and how it treats its players, and recognize that just as the sport changed from this to this, so too can its culture change for the better.